before we get on to the presentation. Over to you, Jackie.
Great. Well, thank you so much for having me as a guest. As Radhika said, I've been doing quite a bit of work on cities. I'm originally from a city in Canada called Calgary. I live in New York City, which is a large, complicated city, like many. I'm currently visiting London, but I do a lot of work, particularly in Africa, in places like Cape Town and Nairobi. And I'm involved in quite a number of different initiatives, all with many, many fabulous colleagues across the globe. And I know that you are eco-ambassadors for many different places and cities, and you know your city or your town well, better than I would. Cities are really fascinating, but really, really important for us to understand in relation to a lot of the challenges that you've been talking about. And I will talk a little bit more about my work as we go along. But I have made a couple main points I think I want for us to discuss and for you to think about as you continue your studies. And first of all, we are basically a planet increasingly of urban dwellers. We are, in fact, approximately 56% of us now live in cities, and many parts of the world are continuing to urbanize fairly rapidly, particularly Africa and Asia. So you can see that almost everywhere the cities are increasing, no matter where you go. And there are some exceptions in some places, like in the United States, where some of the industrial cities have shrunk, but overall, we are increasingly an urban planet. So what we do in cities will make a huge difference to our lives and to the fate of the planet. So it's incredibly important for us to understand them. So I'll go to the next slide, please. And by the way, feel free to jump in, and I would be very curious to know which cities or towns, and if some of you are rural, where you come from, if you want to put that in the chat. So cities are really critical to addressing our sustainability challenges for a number of reasons. You have probably read in Professor Sachs's chapter that a lot of the emissions and some of the key problems are centered in our cities. Cities are often places where we have high consumption. So there's a lot of use of materials. There's a lot of buying. There's a lot of promoting of buying and using our resources. We poor planning, exclusions. You see in this picture, where you might have high rises and nicer, not necessarily nicer, but like fancier buildings, and people living in much poorer quality housing, which is a huge issue. And a lot of our emissions, including our carbon emissions, around 80% of our carbon emissions are coming from cities. And almost all the cities across the world have serious air pollution problems, which create all kinds of health problems. I can see someone comes from Mexico City, someone comes from Tokyo, another big city. I don't know if anyone wants to raise some of the sustainability issues that they see in their own cities. But pretty much all of us have, when we look at our cities, we can see some of these dynamics occurring that are, problems. But the flip side of it is, if we can kind of solve these problems carefully, we can make an enormous impact on the planet. So, yeah, I don't know if any of we have someone coming from a little town in Italy. We have someone from San Jose. We have someone from West Bengal in India. Does anyone want to tell me a little bit about some of what they consider their critical sort of urban problems that they face? Yeah, Lara.
Hi, yeah. So, well, Mexico City has a very big problem because it was built over a lake. So right now the city is sinking, and we have a lot of problems due to that. Water is, well, every day like we have less and less water, and all because of bad city planning. But that has been going on since like the Spanish came and colonized us. So it was like it's really a pressing problem, but I don't think it has a solution because we're a lot of people living in the city, and to fix it, we would have to like evacuate everyone, so that would be very problematic.
Yeah, that's a very serious problem. A lot of cities increasingly have that problem of uh, either overuse of their aquifers or other kinds of water where problems where now with climate change, you go through a more extreme drought and you go through more extreme rain. And so that creates very, very serious problems of sometimes not having enough water and then having too much water. There are questions then of what we were talking about, resilient infrastructure. Are there ways that we can be clever about catching water when we have extreme rain and reserving that water for when we have more drought? Are there ways to protect aquifers? The problems of sinking cities, that has been like a problem for many cities. There are ways to kind of try to address that problem. Venice, of course, has continued to build itself up, and increasingly there with climate change, people are thinking about how do we raise buildings, how do we work with water, allow it to flood in some places, and encourage people to live in other places where it's higher. It is a very, very big problem. And Lara, I'm not saying we can solve Mexico City's problem, but it's a really good example of why we need to rethink our infrastructure and also think about how we work better with nature. So that's a really good example to think about. But I don't think Mexico City has over 20 million people. It's like really important to Mexico. Unlikely that it's where people are going to be evacuating it, but how can now more protection of the water? How can we build more intelligently to address these kinds of problems is critical. So some of you mentioned technology, and then you probably think of things like the cell phone and all the cool new gadgets. But some of what we need to be able to do is to really work with nature to figure out how we can work with it and not against it. And that's a more complex, almost kind of technology that we have to think about. And part of it is also really protecting the resources and the ecology around us that enables our cities to flourish. So again, Laura, I don't have any kind of expertise on Mexico City or the solutions, but I'm certain there's a lot of people working really hard to kind of think along these lines, because the city is so important. So yeah, that's a great example. Does anyone else have anything they want to share from their city or town? And even rural areas are like, if you're from a rural area, your local city or town is very, very important. It's probably where you still get critical services, and where, if you're farming, your produce will still be sold. So there's a very important relationship between urban and rural areas, even though sometimes they get pitted against each other in politics, or people see them as so different. They're actually, very, very symbiotic. Great. So, do we have another hand? Yes, Sana.
I currently live in Tokyo, and I think this issue is becoming a lot more like noticeable and it's receiving a lot more media coverage, but there's a very serious like lack of affordable housing, and it's led to people occupying these like coffin-like houses similar to like Hong Kong. And it's very problematic because it's people are very like tightly packed, and it creates a lot of like health related issues as well. And I guess that just speaks to like how much economic inequality there is in Tokyo, and also like how dense the whole population is, despite our general like population declining.
Yeah, yeah. That question of affordable housing and adequate housing is, of course, central to the Sustainable Development Goal 11. It's one of our key goals around cities that we need to address. And almost every large city has this problem, and it's a very severe problem. Even in very, relatively wealthy areas, we have large levels of homelessness and inadequate shelter. At the same time, you'll often see very fancy and expanding high-end real estate at the same time. So you'll see these kinds of contrasts. And this is going to become a more and more severe problem as we're seeing places like India, like Kenya, places across the globe where people are increasingly moving into cities, and there will need to be a lot more housing built. So, and we need to build that housing in places, again, that are safe, that won't get flooded, that have amenities. So we have a very big set of problems around our cities. And we know that we're going to need to shift some of the ways that we do our financing and our politics, because it's not really working. Even in a very technologically sophisticated and wealthy place like Tokyo, why is it that there still is inadequate housing, right? So that, again, is a question that a lot of people are grappling with, and it is one of our goals to try to solve. So the density and the being in the city is actually a very good thing, in the sense that as people are in cities, you actually, if you use things wisely, you are not expanding out into more and more land and resources. You can live a little bit more compactly and efficiently, and you can have your services near you. And that kind of interaction and density can create a lot of new ideas and a lot of innovation and a lot of opportunity, which is why people keep coming to cities. But if the density is not managed well and equitably, then you get these very serious problems, as you were saying, where poor people are in these very tiny places that are not necessarily very healthy, whereas you get this other wealthier neighborhoods, well-built housing, green spaces, and you have these deep, deep inequalities. So there needs to be some, recognition of this, and some movement of resources into building high quality but still affordable housing. And there are places that have done that better than others. I think places like Vienna have built very good social housing. And so it is possible, but you need to really want to allocate land and resources to having equitable development. And that is actually one of our key goals for our cities. And none of that is easy. All of that requires mobilization and advocacy, because the status quo tends to be towards wealthier people investing in wealthier places. And those wealthier places provide taxes to the city. And so cities often want to encourage those developments. And then the affordable housing, if you just leave it to the market dynamics, is never adequate. So there needs to be a will to put real resources into building these kinds of dense, but good quality, healthy places for people. And that is a massive challenge, which I'm not saying we have solved at all. These are definitely our goals. And different people are coming up with different creative ways to think about how to provide some of this housing, but we're nowhere near where we need to be. So, so we've got the water problem, we have the housing problem. Is there anything else anyone wants to raise from perhaps their own city? Yes.
Yes, I come from India, a city in West Bengal. So in our city, there are, as we live in India, we have the largest population. There are a lot of people which are compacted in a small area, and as India's climatic conditions are um, unequally distributed in some areas which receives a lot of rainfall, the cities they actually get so much flooded that most people die of uh, une- uh, contaminated water, and we actually are facing a lot of problems. And recently a big flood happened in our capital Delhi, where most people died because of this flood, and because of the poor town planning of the people, we a lot of people are congested and packed in a very tight spaces, and the poor people are suffering a lot, while the rich are obviously they are staying in their big buildings, and the poor people, like normal people, they can't uh, stay because of this poor town planning, and because of the unequal uh, climatic distribution, uh, we are facing a lot of problems while surviving. For the last few years, the climatic conditions of India has hit us a lot, and the rainfall and the heat strokes which are happening in uh, India, there are a lot of people are suffering just because of these problems.
Yeah, thank you for raising that. As climate change gets more, continues, we're going to see more and more of the vulnerable in poor housing, in inadequate housing, often in these places that are exposed to more heat because they don't have green spaces, or they're exposed to flooding because they're in low-lying areas or marginal areas. We're going to see more and more of these people suffering and dying if we don't take more critical action. Again, there's a real effort to raise these issues and to start talking about justice issues. I noticed that we have social injustice raised as one of the critical issues, which is at the core of so much of what we're talking about right now. And so again, there needs to be a justice question, both locally, in terms of are the resources going to protect these people adequately, and globally, where, of course, there's a colonial history of extraction by the global north. I highly recommend Amitav Ghosh's book, The Great Derangement, that talks about this in regards to India. And there needs to therefore be more resources going into protecting the climate vulnerable. At the same time, there are people I know in India, like Sheila Patel, this of Spark and Slum Dwellers International, that's working with people to redesign some of these houses to make sure that they're protective, at least of extreme heat. So, there are people who are working both at the sort of grassroots level of trying to support some adaptation measures, and then there are these big global questions of moving resources to address these problems because of these deep injustices. So we really, really must look at the justice question. So I thank someone for raising that. Yes, Anvi.
Hi, yeah, I come from a town maybe like an hour away from New York City in like New Jersey, and like being in New York City a lot, I've like noticed there's a lot of traffic and like a lot of cars releasing a lot of CO2 emissions and burning fossil fuels. And since New York City is so densely populated, again, rising back to that issue, there tends to be less housing or more expensive housing, leading to a lot of like poverty on the streets. And like New York City is a sustainable city, but there still are some issues attempting to be solved. Like in the Hudson River, there are like a bunch of like PCBs like that remain in the river sediment that are like that are unhealthy to the environment, which leads to pollution in the Hudson River, and also kind of not as much as India, but it's contaminating like water sources too. So yeah.
Yeah, again, like other cities, New York City has very serious problems. We have the pollution problems like Mexico City. We also have the flooding problems as well. And we have the vulnerable, for example, who are in basement apartments, some of them not legal, because that's the only housing they can find. And 45 people died when we had extreme rain and they were caught in their basement apartments and couldn't get out, just like in West Bengal, right? So these are our kind of our global issues, and people keep coming to the cities because there are opportunities and jobs, because cities are these great places where, you know, people mix and there are these ideas and businesses emerge to be able to service the people. And so they are these kinds of engines of well-being, but also have unless we design them better and push for the resources so that we don't have these injustices, we're going to have a huge amount of human suffering, more than what we already have, which is already unacceptable. So we have a lot of work to do. And there are a lot of things that we can do. And part of it is having these kinds of discussions to raise these issues and then start locally asking for accountability to see that, you know, some of the resources properly go into these affordable housing, good transit, green spaces, and so forth. So part of this also means that we have to have a really good and smart understanding of cities and these questions, which is one of the reasons I spend a lot of time thinking about them. So Radhika, maybe we can go to the next slide and this is fabulous. This is a very good discussion. I think people have a very good sense of what some of the problems are. So one way to think about the city is that it's almost like a living organism that has its own metabolism that needs to be healthy for all of us to be healthy. Cities require a lot of energy. They require a lot of water. That was already mentioned. All the things that go into building, housing, roads, and, you know, different kinds of infrastructures that are critical, like a proper sewage system, for example, that would try to keep people healthy, sanitation systems, and so forth. All of that requires a tremendous amount of energy. And currently, a lot of that energy is in the form of carbon, which gets burned. And that is why a lot of our cities have very serious air pollution problems and are also responsible for most of our carbon emissions. So at the same time, so that's kind of the food that's going into the city. And then we get a lot of emissions, as I mentioned. We get the polluted water. We get waste of various kinds. And also the heat, because we're building with all this material, which tends to, like concrete and other things like that that absorb heat, and we get this urban heat island effect, which is the city is hotter even than other surrounding areas, and the poorest areas are even hotter on a hot day than the wealthier areas that have more green and different building materials and so forth. So it's kind of this, you think about it as this entity that's very complex that has these flows. And for us to get a better urban metabolism, we need to start using cleaner energy. We need to be smart about using less energy. We need to be smart about using our water in a way that's less polluting and less wasteful. So in a lot of places, a lot of water gets wasted, and the poor pay the most for water. Like I know in Nairobi, many Indian cities as well, the poor will buy water from kiosks, from private vendors, and it's very expensive, whereas the rich often get water coming in from the taps, and it's less expensive, and we don't meter it well, so that sometimes it's wasted. And so we need to think about how do we kind of fix these flows. Consumption is a problem, especially among the hyper elite in the world. It's a huge amount of mass consumption that is grossly wasteful, whereas then the poorest use the least resources. So again, this justice issue is very, very key. So that's why we need to kind of follow the flows of like, who's using what materials and how is that organized? And then are there ways that we can reduce, all this, the waste in a way that, whether it's like recycling or composting, or not just putting piles of plastic into waterways and garbage into big dumps, like, are there ways that we can organize that intelligently as the city and also create jobs? In places like India, again, there are waste pickers who do a very, very critical job. Can they be properly supported and taken care of to do this important job, for example, rather than just exploited? And so, yes, somebody's asking, and I put this, so anyway, there's it's a very interesting way to think about the city as this kind of urban metabolism. And somebody's asking, let's see, about Washington, and why you see, I put that there on purpose, that you see like higher greenhouse gas emissions per capita in some cities and then others, to show you that sometimes, depending on how you structure your city, you can do better or worse on this kind of urban metabolism. So in terms of the emissions, the carbon emissions, does anyone want to take a guess, if they've been to Washington, why Washington might have one reason Washington might have a lot higher carbon emissions than, let's say, New York per capita than New York? Does anyone have a guess on some of that? And I guess it's hard because maybe some of you haven't been to Washington, but factories, more pollution. So yeah, good. Well, Washington is not that industrial. That's not a bad guess. Good. These are good guesses. I like this. Well, so New York City is a bigger city than Washington. It probably has more industry, different climate patterns. These are all excellent. Very, very good. Does anyone know what one of the biggest sources of emissions is in, let's say, most of our cities? Fossil fuels, for sure. And fossil cars, very good. So transportation is one of our biggest problems in the United States, and also pretty much in every city globally. Cars, correct. Vehicles, they all burn, and most of them burn fossil fuels. And it is a very large source of air pollution and carbon emissions. Also buildings, by the way, in New York and Washington. But Washington is very spread out. And so, it doesn't have as good transit and density as New York. So I think one reason that, unsustainable vehicles, one reason is that transport emissions per capita is much, much lower in New York because a lot of people use transit and walk as opposed to cars. That is one reason. And the other might actually be the buildings. Buildings are also a major source of emissions, both the air conditioning and the heating in places like North America. So if you build more transit and more walkability and more something called mixed use, which is where you provide more services and things in neighborhoods, you can cut down trips and you can cut down carbon emissions. So there are ways that we can really intervene in cities with better planning to reduce those kinds of emission problems. But it's true that climate conditions, other things that you have raised, also really do make a difference. But I think mixed use and transit will do some of that cut of emissions. So thank you for noticing that. Great. I think we can go to maybe the next slide. So as I mentioned, cities are some of the most complex, complicated, and also amazing things humans create. If you think about a city where, millions of people interact every day and they cooperate so that people can go on in their lives and meet their basic necessities, they are kind of miracles of cooperation. And that's very hopeful. It also means that there are ways that we can work together to solve these problems. But as we talked about already, we have some common goals we've already agreed upon across the globe around cities, our SDG 11, which is really to make our cities and human settlements safe, resilient, and sustainable. So we have a set of targets around that, the first of which deals with the housing that you've already mentioned. Transportation is another one. You've already mentioned the climate, reducing natural disasters like flooding. So we have some of these goals and these targets. One of the real big problems that you've already identified is that to start to move resources into addressing these problems, which we can address, we know some of the solutions. We need to be able to deal with the injustices, and we need to be able to, really work together, especially being concerned about the vulnerable and the poorest. And a lot of times cities get very socially segregated, and we don't have the kind of mobilization we need to push for some of these changes. But I think right now where we are, with the deep and growing concern about climate and vulnerability, and the fact that so much of these problems are going to have huge impacts for all of us who rely on our cities, there is a really big opportunity to keep pushing for change. And maybe we'll go to the next slide. And what's really great is that there's a growing group of networks and movements at the global level, at the local level, that really are saying, look, we know what we need to do in these cities, and we have goals and values that we have agreed upon. So for that we need to move forward on. And we're seeing action in different cities across the globe, but clearly not enough. So for example, if we want to make a city safe and inclusive, and sustainable, we should really be investing in safe walkways, safe public transport, more green spaces that also allow for biodiversity. And we need to do that in a fair way, in an equitable way. We need to make sure that instead of having like these middle income and high income neighborhoods that don't have mixed use, that, you know, where people have to travel and use cars everywhere, that we should also make sure that we have more mixed use in those neighborhoods, and also infill with more affordable housing. And a lot of times, you know, again, there's this idea of not in my backyard. I agree. I like affordable housing, but I don't want it next to me. And we need to be able to build high quality, nice, affordable housing for people. And we need to be able to bring back that social cohesion so that people are not like, we don't have this segregation and these divisions. And so we need to kind of build that with it, you know, more. And we can do that if we build more public spaces and more access for all in the city. And those cities end up being safer for everybody. And so it's a very big political program, but it is really part of our reducing emissions and our SDGs. And some people are, yes, there's the mention also of electrification. That is also really important. But again, if we don't reduce our car use and we don't really invest more in this kind of public transit and walkability and mixed use, then we'll be doing a lot of mining and extraction, and a lot of biological diversity destruction and ecological destruction more generally, to get the kinds of minerals we need for electrification if we just electrify with the status quo. So, you know, it's again more sustainable for everyone to try to focus on these more social cities, these cities where people feel comfortable being on transit with each other, walking, and then making sure that most of the, you know, we do the electrification, but we're not just prioritizing electric cars again. So yeah, so that's also part of the elements of what we need to do. Yes, that is true. We need charging infrastructure, and that is part of the new kind of infrastructure that we need. And actually, walking all over London, I can see that London as a city has done quite a lot to build that infrastructure, and they've created low emission zones, which penalizes vehicles that are high polluting. And that has also created much cleaner air, and also the push towards electrification. And of course, they have to mitigate some of the equity issues in that as well, because sometimes poorer people have more polluting vehicles, but truthfully, most people who are poorer in a city like London will use public transit. And so it's super equitable to put on those kinds of restrictions to have these lower emission zones. Yes, so these are some of the things we know we can do, and different cities are really working across the globe on these things. I do a lot of work on transportation. So I've given you this example with these pictures of Nairobi, where there's still a lot of investment going into highways. There's that picture on the top you can see is a giant expressway that was being built. A toll road, actually, and it goes from the airport to the wealthier part of town. Very expensive, very regressive infrastructure still. In a city where most people use public transit, they use the little buses you see there, they walk. There's a large number of people who want to cycle. Nairobi's a beautiful green city, as you can see. Although they cut down a lot of trees in order to build the expressway. So we're still seeing development that doesn't make sense. But we're also seeing a lot of people like Cyprian Odada, who is a cycling advocate in Nairobi, advocating for, space. And, she goes, see the beautiful tarmac road. Now see the beautiful non-existent cycle lanes. So you can see that she, is clearly very unhappy, with the way things are. So, and she's advocating very seriously to change that, and that is really what we need. So yeah, let's go to the next slide. So what I'm going to say from this is that we have a lot of great ideas. We know some of the things we need to do. But the biggest challenge, and that's why I'm actually very excited that you are eco ambassadors and you are in cities and towns across the globe, is that we need to bring people together and mobilize, and youth movements are key to making this transition to healthy, sustainable, safe, inclusive cities. But I know we can do it, and we have the ideas and we know what we need to do, and it's getting more urgent. So I think I'm just hoping we can scratch the surface of this conversation, but that I get you to feel like what you're doing and what you're learning is important. And I hope you join with other youth in continuing to push. And this last picture is a picture of young people in Nairobi that saved this fantastic old tree in Nairobi from being cut down. And it was a great victory. And it was because they came together, and that tree will continue to provide shade and space for birds and insects, and beautify the city. So, and help keep the air clean. And so it really does take that kind of mobilization. So being an eco ambassador is really important to all of this. So I think I'll stop there. I know it's just, I'm scratching the surface, and I'm happy to go into more detail and also maybe answer some specific questions you might have.